Dying in an atomic blast is a terrible way to go, but believe it or not, if you met your maker during World War II, there were much worse fates that could have awaited you, like, say, being dissected without anesthesia. The United States dropped a uranium bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, killing at a minimum 40 to 50,000 people immediately or within the first 24 hours. 3 days later, the US detonated a plutonium bomb over Nagasaki. Anyone within roughly a half-mile radius of the initial blast was immediately vaporized. Somewhere around 40,000 people instantly wiped out. Not the most painful fate, but among the most horrifying. You're sitting there minding your own business, and suddenly you hear a lone whistling bomb, and the next thing you know, you're a shadow. Seriously. One Hiroshima mother discovered one of her daughter's sandals blackened except for where the girl's foot had been. Others were burned or injured by falling debris, and medical care immediately after the blast was, of course, patchy at best. Those who did survive the initial explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were by no means out of danger. Many absorbed high doses of radiation from the initial blasts, and others were exposed to radioactivity from debris and fallout after the fact. Short-term radiation poisoning can present with confusion, low blood pressure, bloody diarrhea, fever, and weakness, among other symptoms, progressing to death if the damage is severe enough. Radiation poisoning boosted the Hiroshima and Nagasaki death tolls in the months after the blasts, although it's difficult to isolate these victims from those who died of burns and other injuries. Over longer periods, damage to cells can lead to cancer. Those exposed to radiation from the bombs had a 46% higher likelihood of developing leukemia than other populations. Solid cancers had a smaller but still significant 10.7% risk increase. Cities throughout Germany and Japan were heavily bombed, in some instances leading to uncontrolled fires. The most well-known of these destroyed cities was Dresden. This historic, culturally aware, architecturally rich city reflected much of what people liked about Germany before the war. Unfortunately for art lovers, by early 1945, Dresden was also a rail junction critical to what remaining resistance Germany could offer the advancing Soviets. From February 13th to 15th, Allied aircraft led by the UK dropped thousands of tons of mixed explosives and incendiary bombs on Dresden, flattening much of the city center and igniting a firestorm that would burn for weeks.
If it were to happen today, it would certainly be regarded as a war crime.
The lucky victims died of carbon monoxide poisoning. The unlucky ones succumbed to exposure to heat so intense that steel melted and trees burst into flames as their own resin combusted. 25,000 people died in the bombings and resulting fires, and Dresden was nearly wiped off the map. While it was ultimately rebuilt, initial discussions after the war considered abandoning the city altogether. Typhus is spread by parasites, mites, fleas, lice, and other similar itchy hangers-on. It's not transmitted by a mere bite, but by parasite feces being introduced into the wound. The bacterial infections can then cause rashes, fever, chills, confusion, and nausea, among other symptoms. Untreated, they can progress to meningitis, gangrene, coma, respiratory failure, and death. While strictly speaking, typhus is not transmitted between humans, the lice and other carriers can be. Typhus was epidemic in the concentration camps, causing the death of Anne Frank and her sister after their deportation to Bergen-Belsen. At Buchenwald, inmates were deliberately infected with typhus so that Nazi scientists could compare strains and maintain a living supply of the germs. One relatively bright note from the era comes from, of all places, the Warsaw Ghetto. Typhus struck the city in 1940 after the German occupation, but residents of the tightly controlled Jewish ghetto secretly formed a health commission to combat the epidemic. They took countermeasures, shared information with residents, and did what research they could. Their hard work meant that by July 1942, typhus transmission had effectively reached zero within the ghetto walls. Given the fate of most Warsaw Ghetto residents amid the subsequent uprising, though, it was only a short reprieve. In the Pacific theater, the tropical climate made Allied encounters with new pathogens inevitable. These included fungal infections, dengue, our old Oregon Trail friend dysentery, and the queen of equatorial maladies, malaria.
Public enemy number one, Anopheles, the malaria mosquito.
Spread by the bites of infected mosquitoes, the disease is caused by parasites with a complex life cycle that primarily operates in the liver and the blood. Initial symptoms mirror those of most illnesses: fever and chills, fatigue, aches, and general flu-like malaise. Untreated, malaria can progress to confusion, kidney failure, coma, and death. It's estimated that in early 1942, 24,000 American and Philippine soldiers stationed in the islands had active malaria infections. Even today, with effective anti-malaria drugs in existence, the disease remains a serious health problem. According to the CDC, the world saw an estimated 249 million cases in 2022, with over 600,000 deaths. It remains a leading cause of death in a number of countries, particularly in Africa. The military weren't the only people subject to new diseases. Residents of the Pacific Islands involved in the conflict were affected by illnesses brought by invading armies. A dysentery epidemic in the highlands of Papua New Guinea killed more than 10,000 locals. With that said, the arrival of military medics and associated public health efforts meant that some local people received improved medical treatment coupled with more modern information about disease control. After the war's end, horrified outsiders learned what victims of Germany and Japan's occupations had known firsthand. Both powers had conducted medical experiments on unwilling human beings. The Holocaust Encyclopedia identifies 3 types of experiments conducted by Nazi scientists.
We dissected the bodies and collected the eyes for research. It's really disturbing.
The first was intended to help them understand how they could aid the survival of active Axis personnel, so subjects were experimented on at high altitudes or in freezing cold. The second type of experiment looked at medications and treatments for communicable diseases, which of course meant inoculating the captive subjects with any illnesses the researchers wished to study, or exposing them to poisons to test antidotes. The third and most appalling class of these studies were those investigating racial and ideological goals. These included Joseph Mengele's infamous tests on twins, where one would remain relatively healthy and the other was experimented on.
You have no body, you have nothing. Everything is his. He's the master of you, of your body.
Researchers also explored how different pathogens affected different populations and investigated mass sterilization methods for use on populations they deemed unfit. Japan's researchers were equally sadistic. In Unit 731, they froze limbs solid to test hypothermia treatments, dissected living people without anesthesia to study systems that work inside the body, and deliberately caused gangrene to observe its progress. Unit 731 workers also tested chemical, physical, and radiological weapons on live subjects.
The unit also tested on prisoners with bubonic plague, cholera, smallpox, botulism, and other diseases.
Sexual violence was part of the program too. Researchers wanted to study venereal infections and pregnancy. No Japanese researcher was ever tried for those crimes. The commander of the United States Occupation Force, General Douglas MacArthur, granted them immunity in exchange for access to what they'd learned. Shark attacks are a relatively rare phenomenon. The Florida Museum of Natural History's International Shark Attack File reports a worldwide total of 91 bites in 2023, further specifying that the sharks were provoked in 22 cases. And if you know that scene from Jaws, you know where this is going.
You know the thing about a shark, he's got lifeless eyes, black eyes, like a doll's eyes.
On July 30th, 1945, the United States heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis had arrived at a naval base in the Mariana Islands and dropped off components for the atomic bomb that would soon destroy Hiroshima. The ship was heading towards the Philippines to prepare for the invasion of Japan, but it missed its rendezvous. The Japanese submarine I-58 launched a torpedo at the ship, hitting a fuel tank. It took 12 minutes to sink. Approximately 900 of the 1,196 personnel evacuated into the water to await rescue or capture. Instead, they got sharks, big aggressive sharks. They first ate the dead, then moved on to the living men huddled together in groups. In one incident, hungry soldiers opened a can of Spam, but immediately discarded it when it attracted more sharks. Survivors were finally spotted on August 2nd, and 316 men were rescued from the water by the end of August 3rd. Most of the men had died in the initial sinking or by drowning, exposure, or salt poisoning. The shark victims, numbering anywhere from a few dozen to over 150, loom large in the US Navy's memory. The devastation of World War II led to starvation in many of the affected territories. The Soviet Union was hit hardest, particularly Ukraine, Belarus, and besieged Leningrad. But food shortages across occupied Europe, Asia, and the Pacific claimed many lives, including, for example, 5% of the population of Greece and around 1.5% of Austrians. Famine was a weapon of war. Germany planned to control the food supply in the occupied Soviet Union, calling it Der Hungerplan. The disruption led to the deaths of a probable 7 million Soviet civilians. In September 1944, train operators in the Netherlands went on strike in hopes that the disruption would help the Allied armies liberate the country. In retaliation, German authorities stopped food from entering the country, leading to a hunger winter that killed around 20,000 Dutch citizens before it was over.
It created a food shortage so severe the Dutch government encouraged its people to forage for acorns and chestnuts.
Among its most famous survivors was Audrey Hepburn, who later recalled eating grass and tulip bulbs to survive. When deprived of food, the human body begins to consume its stores of carbohydrates and fats, moving on to muscle tissue if necessary. Organs can shrink, and people may feel cold, distracted, and irritable. Eventually, without adequate calories, the body can even eat muscle tissues in the heart. Hallucinations and cardiac arrhythmia can occur in late stages, followed by death. Survivors of serious malnutrition may suffer lifelong after effects. Those who were children in Leningrad during the siege had higher rates of breast cancer and cardiovascular disease as adults, and fetuses in utero during the Dutch hunger winter suffered higher rates of schizophrenia and diabetes as adults. Poison was among the preferred weapons of the Nazi genocide machine. Gas chambers began in 1939 at euthanasia centers in Germany proper. They were used to murder the mentally ill and disabled, who were considered undesirable by the regime.
Superior races must battle inferior races or be corrupted by them.
As the Reich expanded, gas chambers were added to concentration camps and even adapted to mobile use, with sealed trucks used to kill people in occupied or contested territory. This innovation was initially intended to reduce fatigue and distress among German soldiers tired of shooting so many people. The most common poison used was carbon monoxide, either industrially produced or captured as exhaust from running diesel engines. Later in the war, some concentration camps began using Zyklon B, a pesticide with the active ingredient hydrogen cyanide. Cyanide poisoning causes chest pain or tightness, changes to heart and breathing rhythm, and seizures. The horror of suffering this end in a room full of other frightened, similarly affected people is impossible to imagine. World War II was fought on land, in the air, and on and underneath the water, with the use of submarines. Submarines were harder to sink than surface boats, but could be destroyed with torpedoes or depth charges, bombs that sent shockwaves crashing into the subs. The United States lost 52 submarines during the war, along with 3,506 personnel. This 20% casualty rate for the submarine corps was the highest among American forces. But what happened when a sub sank? It's hard to find contemporary reports, but we can draw some conclusions. First of all, sailors may have been injured from the initial impact. When the USS San Francisco hit an underground mountain in 2005, 98 of the 127 crew members aboard were injured, and one later died. The fate of a submarine crew depends on the extent and type of damage. If water is coming in quickly, the crew will drown. If leaks are slow or limited, crews can survive a number of days with the oxygen they have, but only if the electrical systems are still operating to run the equipment. Crewmen trapped on a sunken submarine may succumb to suffocation, cold, or drowning, depending on the conditions on board. Finally, if the submarine sinks in very deep water, past the rescue limit of 600 meters, exterior water pressure will ultimately crush the vehicle and everyone inside it.